Hi BookTube, it's Amy and I'm back with the next portion of my Q&A. So we have a question from Joe Smith and they ask, where would you most like to travel and which book would you want to be a character in? So at some point I would like to travel abroad, and I think my first trip outside of North America is going to be, at least I hope it's going to be, a visit to the United Kingdom. Just because I read a lot of British authors, and so it would be quite fun, I think, to visit, some of their homes, some of the places where they wrote, some of the settings that they wrote about, and that sounds like quite a nice vacation to me. Joe also asks, which book would you most want to be a character in? So I've always thought it would be kind of fun to be a character in Proust's In Search of Lost Time. Just because the narrator tells the story in such a detailed, vivid way, and it would be interesting to be a part of those scenes, to be a part of those social moments. And of course, as a character, you would find out whether they were everything he said they were, or whether they were insignificant and were only given significance through the narrator's storytelling abilities. Now we're on to a question from Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics. Do you love Niagara Falls as much as I do? And if so, when did you first visit and how many times have you been? Me, first visit when I was 3 years old with parents, second as an undergrad from Kent State. Took off with friends for a weekend. I've been 4 times now, but not since approximately late 90s, before we needed blue passports. I've been on Maid of the Mist, Behind the Falls, Houdini Museum, The Barrels, and Ripley's Believe It. So yes, I have been to Niagara Falls, and it's quite spectacular. It really is beautiful and breathtaking, and if you've never been there, if you go, you've really got to go to the Canadian side. Not to brag, but Canada has the best falls. The Horseshoe Falls, which is what we think of as Niagara Falls, is actually in Canadian territory, and on the Canadian side, you could stand up right next to the falls. On the American side, they have the smaller falls, and they have sort of an overhead lookout. Not quite as much to do on the American side, I understand, but the Canadian side is really where you want to go if you're traveling. And I have been several times. I did grow up just about a 2 hours drive north of Niagara Falls, give or take. And the first time I really recall going was when I was 12. In middle school, we did a year-end trip, and they took all the grade 7s to Niagara Falls for a couple of days. Now, I can only think they were completely insane because they booked a bunch of hotel rooms through a travel company, and some poor teachers and chaperones had to chaperone about 40 12-year-olds in a hotel overnight. And we got up to all sorts of shenanigans, taking ice from the ice machine and dropping it off the balconies, using the telephones to call random rooms and seeing who we get, much to the dismay of the other guests at the hotel. And eventually they banned ice and they banned us using the telephones. But it was quite a fun trip. We did go on Maid of the Mist. We saw the locks. We went to the, I don't even know what you call it, but the IMAX or the 3D theater about that showed a short film with the history of the falls. Several people have been insane and gone over the falls in barrels for the fun of it. There was several incidents over the years. And then, of course, you have that tightrope walker from the States several years back who got permission to tightrope walk over the falls, although they did make him wear a harness, which is probably good considering it was broadcast on live TV. But I went when I was 12, and I've been back just to see the falls several times. I have grandparents down in New York State, so a couple of times on the way back from visiting, we would stop off just to go and look at the falls. And I remember being there in late December, early January once. And it gets quite frigid, but it's also quite beautiful because when it's cold enough, the mist freezes and coats everything in ice. And so the railings are ice, and it's just this great, beautiful clusters of ice all over the place. But I don't think many tourists actually go to Niagara Falls in winter, which is why you can get a pretty good view of the falls in the winter. But yes, I do quite love Niagara Falls. Scrolling on up, we have one final question, which I'm going to admit is kind of a heavy question, and I questioned whether I should respond to this, but I did say I would respond to anything. So the question says, this is from Chris, and Chris says, "Hey Amy, lately in BC, the province of British Columbia, pipeline protests are taken to a new level. The oil industry-backed RCMP recently colonized, in other words, evicted at gunpoint, Indigenous lands to make way for another pipeline. From blocking railway lines to high-traffic metropolitan intersections, protesters are in any way possible, supposedly, preventing the Canadian economy from effectively capitalizing. If the objective of a pipeline is to make money, yet our protesters can so easily prevent making money, does the pipeline not seem meaningless? Anyway, just wondering, what are your thoughts?" So this is obviously a very politically charged issue. And Chris, I've never had a comment from you before. I don't know what your motivation is in asking this particular question, but I guess you do seem to have a particular political bent here. It's interesting that you should say the oil industry backed RCMP recently colonized. Yeah. So the RCMP is a federal police service. The only reasonable way they would be said to be funded by oil is because they are funded by tax dollars, and oil companies pay taxes to the federal government. To say that the RCMP recently colonized, well, that is a loaded term. Evicted at gunpoint, I believe they were arrested for violating an injunction to clear a road to allow a company that seemed to have a legal right to be there to continue building a pipeline. Now, whether they had a legal right to be there or not is really up to the courts to decide. We do have a rule of law in this country. Now, I firmly believe in the right of any citizen to protest. I believe in the Indigenous right of self-determination. But from what I understand, the Indigenous nation in question, their official council, is actually in favor of this pipeline, and it is a small segment of this nation who are against the pipeline and have decided to protest, which is all good and fine. They have a right to protest. Anyone in Canada has a right to protest, a right to civil disobedience. But when you participate in a protest, when you participate in civil disobedience, there is a chance that if you are breaking the law, you will be arrested. And that is what seems to have happened in this case. Call it colonialism if you will, but this has snowballed into a larger issue for the rest of the country. So the major point in this that concerns me is the blockade outside of Belleville, Ontario, which has for over a week been blocking rail service between Toronto and Ottawa. And this is the track where the CN trains run. So those are the freight trains, the supply chain for Ontario. And so goods have not really been moving by rail between Ontario and Quebec and the rest of the country for the past week. But that's also the line where passenger rail runs. And it's gotten to the point where, because of various blockades and solidarity across the country, Via Rail has had to cancel all passenger rail service within Canada, which is absolutely absurd. Well, people certainly have the right to protest. Your right to protest ends when you disrupt the lives of other people to an extent where thousands of CN Rail and Via Rail workers could potentially be laid off, and where thousands of Canadians are unable to travel to their destinations, to travel to weddings, to funerals, to work, to school, for their vacations. It's just, it's an absurd situation, and I just don't understand what Via Rail passenger service or CN freight trains have to do with the pipeline that the particular Indigenous members of the Indigenous nation in BC are protesting. And there are injunctions for these protesters to be removed from the rail lines, but because of the politics of the situation, the OPP, the Ontario Provincial Police, have not acted yet. The provincial government has not acted. The federal government has not acted. And so we are essentially in a stalemate where the protesters are continuing to illegally block rail lines, and a lot of people are just stuck. And I fail to see how blocking rail lines in Ontario and essentially pissing off a bunch of people is going to help them in their cause to prevent a pipeline in BC. And I mean, if you go against a injunction, you should expect to be arrested. It's just the way rule of law works in Canada. And I'm not pro-pipeline, but I'm not anti-pipeline either. They're sort of a necessary evil in this day and age as we wait to transition to renewable energy. But at this point in time, there is oil to be transported. It has to be transported some way, and a pipeline is certainly safer. I'll leave it there, kind of a heavy note to the end of this Q&A. Thank you for asking questions. If you have further questions, feel free to leave them, and I might follow up if there are more.